Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of the Western Sydney Business Podcast. Today I'm joined by Matthew Sartori. G'day Matt, how are you?
Not too bad, Thomas. How are you?
Yeah, doing well, thanks. Thanks for coming on the podcast. So Matt, you're the director of Shear Property Group. You want to give us an overview of Shear Property Group?
Yeah, sure. So Shear essentially is a social infrastructure real estate agency. So that's sales and leasing, buyer's agency and tenant representation across the social infrastructure sectors. So that essentially includes seniors housing, aged care, healthcare, retirement living, childcare, and also healthcare and disability housing.
Okay, and I mean, that's quite a broad sector that you focus on. Any reason why you stepped into that field of work instead of, myself, I'm in traditional, commercial development, land, sort of bread and butter stuff?
Yeah.
How view of that?
So I have a bit of an interesting past. I studied international business. I got a role as a business development manager in a construction company. So we were doing a lot of commercial work and saw that, we were lucky in doing a little bit of healthcare work. So started looking into that space, realizing there weren't very many people kind of servicing the front end of that sector. So for example, I talked to operators who were looking to do more sites, more developments, and I was talking to fund managers and investors that wanted to do more but couldn't find the operators. So I was fortunate in finding a role in a real estate company, spent 2 years specializing on that. And I always thought these were the growth industries of the next 20 years. So to get in as a relatively younger gentleman and to give that a crack, and 2 years in real estate, 1 year in venture capital, and then set up Shear Property, which has been going for the last 3.5 years.
Fantastic. Congratulations on that. So you mentioned a couple of the sectors: seniors living, healthcare, education, aged care, retirement living. Can you give us an overview of these sectors and what each one of them actually means for the person that may not know?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, there's essentially 4 types of seniors offerings. So there's over 50s housing, which is perhaps most similar to a standard residential dwelling, catering to the over 50s community. It typically has wider corridors, accessible bathrooms, wheelchair ramps, etc. Then we have lifestyle estates or manufactured housing estates. So they're perhaps most similar to a caravan park with a bit more permanent residential accommodation.
Okay.
In those instances, typically you buy the house and you rent the land. And that enables you to unlock the capital out of your house and land and retire in style, I guess.
Is that similar to Leppington? They're the one that's, I think it's Integra or something like that near there?
Integra, that's the one, yep.
Sure.
So they've done really well there. There's also, Ingenia, Aspen, and a number of different kind of groups that specialize in that. We also then have retirement villages, which are a little bit more similar to a hotel. They work under a deferred management fee or a 99-year lease. So essentially the funds or the costs of that are typically paid at the end. But that can be assisted or independent living. And it's a bit more, I guess, there are some really exciting new fee structures and models that are kind of coming around that. And then lastly, you've got aged care facilities, which are a little bit more reminiscent of a hospital. That's typically 24-hour care for our most vulnerable, dementia and the likes.
All right. So like Western Sydney is rapidly growing. It's, it's all about new development. It's all about new housing and all these things coming in. Can you tell us about the communities that are being developed? Do we need to be developing those in these new communities, or, where do these things fit into this brand new Western Sydney?
Yep, definitely. Well, I did actually forget to talk about healthcare, childcare, and disability housing, but I guess we could talk about that in this little category. So essentially, if you were to use childcare as an example, with a lot of these new estates that have come out, using a 3,000 home estate, for example, if an average household is 2.5 residents, that means a population of about 8,000 people. 5% of that would be 0 to 4 catchment, although that might be 6 to 7. So essentially, you'd have about 400 to 600 children. That should comfortably be serviced by about 2 to 3 childcare centres, between 80 to 120 places. So that should typically be planned for in new estates. Then you've got disability housing. Disability housing is just basically like regular housing. Disability residents want to be in the locations the same way that non-disabled people want to be. So proximity to transport, healthcare, retail, parks, etc. That's definitely preferred as well. With new estates, aged care and retirement, it's a really interesting kind of case study, I guess, where they've historically generated 85% of their market within a 5K radius. With all these new housing estates, and Oran Park's an excellent example where Anglicare did Chesalon Village, they always assumed the uptake there to be quite some time because there wasn't a huge population out there. But with the younger families that moved out, the elderly then tended to follow. So there is definitely an argument for new housing estates, new estates to encompass aged care and retirement. And it's great to see, for example, up in Willowdale, Stockland have put the retirement village, which I believe has done quite well. And then lastly, with healthcare is very kind of dependent on the doctors and the operators. So, I mean, there's a need in all of these estates, but securing those doctors or that doctor interest is very important.
Do you feel like this aspect of development is not being forgotten, but probably just not at the forefront of mind? Do you think? Like, it's definitely not something that I think about. So from an outsider's point of view, I really wouldn't think about those sort of things. But do you feel at all it's a bit forgotten or a bit secondary?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I mean, the strength of the residential market over the last 5 to 10 years has really meant that these sectors have somewhat become forgotten. So large lots, for example, I mean, there's such demand out in the West for this housing stock that it hasn't really been considered, but I think it's really important. So, for example, aged care and retirement back in the day, they actually used to be able to come out to the West. Aged care typically needed a floor plate or a land size of 5,000 square meters. Independent living needed up to 2 hectares, up to 4 hectares. So for those reasons, it used to be achievable. And now, given the strength of the residential market and the uptake, it really has been forgotten about. Not every developer has an understanding of what is needed with a lot of these different service groups and also, I guess the wants of those operators and what they're looking for. So that has made it somewhat troubling, but it's given me a role. And I think the exciting kind of, or the most exciting part is with the NDIS kind of implementing this specialist disability accommodation. It's a sector that's really starting to thrive from the private realm. So the private realm is now considering where can we best put these kind of homes, and essentially that's guided by resident uptake. So you really need to kind of cater for those residents and give them what they're asking for.
Great. Looks like you're pretty well across it. Now, this next question I had was quite broad. So, and it sort of pertains to Western Sydney. Western Sydney is a huge region. What's the supply demand looking like, and where are the pockets that really need attention for, I know you've got 5 sectors there, so maybe run me through all the ones that you think need the most attention in Western Sydney, and that, where the real supply and demand lies.
Yeah, sure. Well, look, I mean, with respect to kind of the wants and needs in particular, what's really interesting is Western Sydney is just like the Central Coast, just like every part of Sydney, every part of Australia, in that we all grow old, we all get sick. Many of us have kids, and there's those that are vulnerable within our sector, within these communities as well. So, I guess aged care and retirement, again, like I mentioned, back in the day, it was actually easier to build these facilities out west. There was perhaps a bit of a need, but with aged care planning instruments coming through, the aged care was somewhat serviced. Retirement, however, is very hard to kind of make stack again, with land prices kind of increasing. They're really having to change their model. The supply of childcare has been quite strong in recent times with these new estates. Depending on where it is and depending on land zonings, I'm finding. So for example, Gregory Hills has a very strong supply of childcare, but it also has an equally strong demand of childcare. So what might have been perceived an oversupply 5 years ago is probably being met now. And, having a look at those metrics as to how many 0 to 5 year olds are within that catchment is very important. Very easily, though, I mean, there's no licensing in terms of how many centres can be built. So you can find, for example, if the ratio falls below 1, or even if it's between 1 to 2, there could be a perceived oversupply of the area. And that has happened in parts of Western Sydney. And then with respect to disability housing, again, this is a relatively new initiative. So it needs to come across Western Sydney. It needs to come across all aspects of Sydney. We have had, quite a number of families with that need. And with that, there's also an additional disability services who are now looking for a home as part of the new initiative.
So with the disability housing, how can somebody, I know we've dealt on a couple of things in the past, what does that actually entail for somebody that's developing some property? How can they sort of support that industry? What does that actually mean for people?
Yeah, sure. So essentially, the industry is really kind of favorable to a salt and pepper approach. So for example, if it's an apartment block of 60 units, enabling 11 to 15 units within that block tends to be preferred. But there's also townhomes, villas, group homes, and standard homes that can be considered amongst these communities as well. I think the best approach in those instances is to have a look at the data in terms of forecasted demand. Talk to the right operators. So you do need to be registered with the NDIS to be a specialist disability accommodation management provider or operator, and just ascertain that interest, and then essentially understand what the product looks like and how it will best kind of work within that environment.
Okay, no, that's pretty good. I think we've been through. Is all this stuff being addressed enough? Do you think, like in Western Sydney, it all seems to be resi, it all seems to be, commercial and Aerotropolis and this. I mean, there's an aging population out here, no doubt. Do you think it's being addressed enough, like by councils and government?
Yeah, so it's an interesting one. I guess aged care is perhaps the one where there's most need. I've found, coming from a Metro Investments kind of sales background, it is very hard to make an aged care facility stack when comparing that to the strength of the residential market.
Yeah, moving units,
yeah, exactly. So, I mean, there are particular areas where you can tend to find something that works, but in reality, in having a look at these sectors, I think the sectors actually need more help across the board, whether that's from town planning or support from council for additional kind of, some form of leeway to enable them to build in these communities. Operators still tend to like to be in established communities. So if we can get that in the heart of Liverpool, in the heart of Fairfield, and there have been some really exciting things occurring, like vertical villages, etc., which do come with traditionally higher operational costs, but people are encompassing different uses now and making that work. With respect to, I guess my biggest personal advice has been health employment precincts across the board, not just Western Sydney, but in Sydney in general. There's been a push to essentially enable a 25% increase in kind of FSR and height if you enable 25% of that development to be healthcare or health services facility.
Right, okay.
Which is fantastic in theory, but when a typical developer wants to kind of maximize the residential space, they'll typically design a medical center on the ground floor, and what that's eventually led to is 12 medical centers designed around a hospital, which doesn't really kind of benefit the hospital or the medical centers competing with each other. I think if they were to encompass disability housing, disability services, aged care and retirement, I mean, aged care is a perfect blend of the two. It's a hospital, a hospital that you live in essentially. So for that reason, I think having a bit more of a horizontal kind of, perception of what would create a sustainable health employment precinct is super important in those precincts. The other thing as well is kind of the blend together, of some of these services, I think is important as they complement each other.
Can you go into that in a little bit more depth, that last point? Like I remember we've spoken before about the aged care living plus childcare actually being a really good combo. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, sure. So look, Wollongong's doing some great things. Wollongong Uni, they're encompassing childcare, aged care, and healthcare and the like. I am personally super passionate about health hubs, or social hubs for that matter. In countries like Malaysia, they've been able to create hospitals with retail centers and a lot of those things. But just as a couple of examples of brilliant blends, aged care and childcare, running initiatives amongst the two is great for both the children and the elderly. I personally really like the idea of childcare and medical. The biggest thing for both of those developments is parking. So medical doesn't necessarily, exactly. So medical doesn't always kind of require maximum parking between the hours of 7 to 9 or 3 to 6. Childcare does. So if you're able to alleviate that pressure, I think that's a really beneficial thing. The other really interesting point there is if your child shows any sign of sickness, you do have to go and get a note from a doctor. And that can really kind of impede on a parent's day in the morning. The other really interesting thing that's become very kind of prominent has been health and retail. So, coffee shops and some of the health offerings and food offerings within the hospitals have actually become very successful. So encompassing that in its feasibility of a healthcare development is also something now that's a step forward in the right direction. But, you know, even a blend of disability housing, childcare, healthcare, you know, I guess the more we put that stuff together, the more it's a one-stop shop for different services that, you know, the residents need and the community needs.
There's a great example down there. Where's Gregory Hills somewhere? There's like that whole medical hub development down that way. It's lovely. Yeah, it's a really good state-of-the-art development.
So the concept and the thinking behind that was, let's create a community gathering area where 70% of that's healthcare, 30% of that's actually kind of retail community focused with real estate, florists, etc.
Yeah.
And bringing some really great restaurant, you know, kind of eatery kind of stuff there, which is also great for the doctors, for the people visiting those doctors, for the people running kind of presentations. And I think what's really exciting about that development in particular is it's not white walls and white floors. It's a really kind of innovative design and like a really kind of welcoming kind of aesthetic. I like to go there personally.
Yeah, me, like, you know, I went there, I was like, wow, this place is actually, you could come work here and go to the cafe. If there's like co-working hubs, it's actually a vibe, you know, it's a really nice part of the world to sit down and work. So I think more of those things need to happen.
Completely agree. And a lovely developer.
Yeah, no, fair enough. What other trends are you seeing in these sectors? You just mentioned that, you know, we just talked about Soma, and then we just talked about childcare and aged care blended together. Any other trends you want to comment on that you're seeing in these sectors?
Yeah, well, I think one thing that's really exciting is the maturity of a lot of these sectors. So disability housing is really kind of just starting. So we're going to see more and more kind of interest buyers and concepts and offerings. Some that have already kind of hit the market are fantastic. But childcare in particular. Look, I'm not an expert on international childcare, but I think we have to be one of the most sophisticated kind of service offerings when it comes to childcare in the world. There are some amazing operators, and in the last 3 or 4 years, particularly, I've seen them up their game. And it's also a really interesting kind of thing with childcare, I guess, with an aging population. We are seeing, you know, I guess, well, it's just a theory is that, you know, essentially participation rates are going to need to kind of be higher to really kind of service those who are retiring or need more assistance. For Western Sydney in particular, the more aged care, the more healthcare, and childcare for that matter, the more of these services that we can actually provide to our communities from a jobs perspective on a per square meter basis, particularly with aged care. I mean, you know, a 105 residential aged care facility could sometimes have up to 120 staff. With staffing ratios for childcare centres, you know, I mean, the ratios are 1 to 4, 1 to 5, and 1 to 10. So you can typically have about 15 staff. And that's really exciting for kind of creating local jobs in the area.
Yeah, certainly.
And lastly, with disability housing, I'm just, look, I mean, in terms of trends that I've seen, it's really great how people are thinking with the residents in focus. Data is coming out and people are kind of responding. So the trends haven't started yet, but I'm really excited to see what actually comes within that sector.
Fantastic. One thing I wanted to talk about was, is COVID-19 having any impact on this sector, or, you know, highlighting this any further? Again, I'm not in this part of the business. You know, has that had any impact?
Look, it certainly has. Although that being said, you know, it's a really interesting kind of way to look at it for each sector. So I think personally, the childcare kind of perception at the moment is perhaps not accurate. So a lot of people are kind of hearing free childcare on one side of the fence, but on the other side of the fence, what you've got is essentially those who had many of their staff that were actually kind of visa holders. So they're not seeing the JobKeeper benefits. Before it was kind of private and publicly funded. So the private groups would put in the money. That's no longer happening. So essentially the money provided to that center is almost at cost as to what it costs to service that child. So operators in the short term aren't really making much, and they aren't really losing much. Some are doing a lot better than others, just dependent on that location. What's really exciting to see is disability services have been kind of, or the NDIS space has somewhat come to the table in terms of making sure people are safe during this time. So I'm just seeing notifications, etc., about, you know, them coming to the market with with certain offerings very quickly, which is great. Although, look, as with all sectors, nothing's perfect. To be honest with you, on the aged care and the retirement front, it's been really tough to say, mostly because aged care is halfway through a royal commission. So they've already been somewhat stuck, or I guess the market's been somewhat stuck in terms of where it goes until that's really finalized. In terms of development, though, across childcare, across disability housing, most of these builds can be 12 to 24 months. And, the development process is still 12 to 24 months. So yeah. On a lot of the early planning stuff, it hasn't impacted too much. Immediate jobs or jobs over the next 12 months, certain operators have changed their stance. But, these are services still needed in the community.
Okay, makes a lot of sense. Any other sort of exciting horizons, things on the horizon for these sectors that you want to let us know about? You've given us a pretty great overview of this part of the business. Anything else we should know before we go?
Yeah, look, I think it's just really important for private developers, operators and councils to really kind of think how these services can play a role within the estates or within kind of local areas. So for example, if you look at Harry Triggerboff, who's a predominant residential developer or service departments, he started encompassing childcare amongst many of his developments, which makes sense because if you're building 600 apartments, you're expecting there's going to be quite some significant childcare demand in that apartment alone. I guess with respect to the exciting stuff, I'm still very, very excited about vertical hubs. And I think from a planning perspective, if somebody was to kind of amalgamate some of these services, I think there should be perhaps a little bit more looked into as to how that could work and how that could kind of get through from the planning regime. And look, apart from that, I think it's exciting that, the government is really kind of backing this NDIS scheme. The industry is starting to wake up to it. Operators are starting, or developers are starting to consider it as part of their estates. The question is, just how good a job can we do? And, obviously, how many jobs does it bring in for the area? What does that estate look like from a diversity perspective? So I think that's perhaps the most exciting part of, people starting to consider these services in these communities.
Matt, I think you've given us a fantastic overview of that part of the business and your business. I thank you very, very much for coming on the podcast. It's great to have someone as passionate as you for this sector of the business. So thanks very much for what you do.
It's an honor, Tom. Thanks so much for having me.
It's my pleasure. Speak to you soon, Matt. See ya.
Cheers, mate. Bye.